Well, we're going to start a little early because we have a big program this evening. My name is William Bell Elliott, and I was one of the outsiders that discovered the geysers, 1847. I was poking around with my son and this stick. This is called a geyser pony, and you use this when you're walking on the trails up there in those delicate hills. We were part of the John C. Fremont survey party, and while I was up there, my son and I, we saw this big grizzly bear, and God, you know, we thought, gee, this is our chance to grab one. So we were chasing this bear when I ran across this nasty big hole in the ground that was spewing fire and steam and making all sorts of racket. And I've never, ever in my life seen anything like that. And boy, I hightailed it out of there double quick. 18 miles to Cloverdale, and I've never been back there in 160 years since. So some people in the History Center asked me to do a program on the geysers. And I refused to do a program on the geysers because, like I said, I'm not going back there again. But luckily, there are three well-qualified people in this audience that are going to give a great presentation on the history of the geysers all the way back to the year dot. But before we do that, I've got to thank some people, some volunteers that helped put this program together. There's Audrey and Louise and Carolyn and George and Scott and Bill back there in the corner. Without these people, we would not do these sort of programs. So let's give them a big round of applause. Also, I'd like to introduce our executive director of the Historical Society, Alyssa Morash. Alyssa, are you here? Well, everybody knows Alyssa. If you don't, you'll meet her sometime. She's done a terrific job with the Historical Society and putting Cloverdale on the map. I also have to thank Danielle Matthews Separis. This woman has been terrific. Pardon me, I'm losing. It took me weeks and weeks to grow this thing. She is the manager of government and civic affairs for Calpine, and she agreed to sponsor this program. She gave us, the Historical Society, $300 to cover the expenses. So every dollar that you gave tonight goes directly to the Historical Society because Calpine covered the expenses to put on this program. Thank you, Calpine. Also, I want to thank the Preston Vineyard and Winery. Lou Preston and Susan are pouring wine this evening. Their own wine, by the way, nobody else's. So we hope that after the show, you'll go over there and partake of some of their good stuff. Well, let's see. I think that's it. Just to say that the Geysers Then and Now is about to start. Our first speaker is a native Californian, born in Oakland, grew up in the geysers in a mining town in a one-room schoolhouse. And in her early years, she went to this little one-room schoolhouse until the mine shut down in the early 50s. Then she came to Cloverdale to finish her education, graduated Santa Rosa High School, went on to get a BA, Bachelor of Arts in the Humanities at UC Berkeley. 2 years later, she got her teaching credentials from UC Davis. And for the next 33 years, she worked for the Napa Valley School District, half of the time as a speech therapist, the other half in the classroom. Would you please welcome Karen Pettigrew from Napa, California. Karen, would you take your seat? We're not starting yet. There's two more to go. Some people just are so eager, and that's great. usually I have to hit people on the head to get them up here. The next speaker is a geologist. He got his education University of Missouri in Kansas City, BS in Geology, the Bachelor of Science. He went on to the University of Montana to get his PhD. Shortly thereafter, he was, along the way, assistant professor of earth sciences at Central Missouri State University. And then he went into the private sector and worked his way through different companies in the energy field. He spent 10 years with Phillips Petroleum and went to work for Calpine in 1990 and retired in 2011. And along the way, he was co-author and author of about 20 technical publications. So now he's retired. He came to speak to us from Sebastopol. Could you please welcome Joseph Beal? This thing was only $4 and I can see why. The third speaker is an employee of Calpine. He has a Bachelor of Science degree from UC San Diego. When he graduated, he took a different path. He went to Japan to teach English for 2 years. And then when he came back, he decided, well, I guess I better get a job. So he went to work for General Electric Nuclear Energy Division in San Jose. And then from there, about 15 years ago, he came to Calpine. And he's the engineering project manager from Calpine. And along the way, he raised a family. And in the last few years, he decided to get his MBA from Sonoma State University. So he graduated this spring from Sonoma State. He lives in Cloverdale. Please welcome John Avery. So I'm going to get out of here and let Karen start off.
Thank you so much, Mr. Elliott.
Just call me Wild Bill.
Well, as Mr. Elliott told you, he was tracking down a grizzly bear, and he happened upon the billowing, steamy geysers. Not very many years after, the Big Geysers Resort was underway, already hosting visitors from near and far. So, pretty soon, the canvas-covered structures were replaced by the Geysers Hotel. And I think some of you have seen this in some of the pictures already displayed. A beautiful two-story building like this, okay, which considerably improved the comfort of the guests. Famous people came to the Geysers as well, the Prince of Wales, for instance, for whom apparently the trip up to the Geysers was nearly as noteworthy as the Geysers itself. He came from the Calistoga route over the old Hogsback Ridge Road. He dropped 1,500 feet in elevation, 35 hairpin turns, and finally arrived at the Geysers and the gates of Hades, the Geysers Canyon. His mother, he told his mom, Queen Victoria, and she invited Clark Foss, the stagecoach driver, to London. And it's all history now. So, to tell you the truth, there was a big turnover of proprietors at the Big Geysers Resort the second half of the 19th century. My great-grandparents, Reuben and Georgie Curry, arrived at the Geysers in 1892 and were proprietors for most of the following 19 years. They brought their toddler son and their 8-year-old daughter, who were my grandfather, George Frank Curry, and my great aunt, Grace. So coming up to the geysers on the Cloverdale Road, and eventually the Healdsburg Road too, was a bumpy, dusty ride as well. I love looking at this photo because what did these folks do after they tolerated that incredible journey? Well, they went right over to the Geysers Canyon and started hiking among the steamy fumaroles. So if you look at these hardy souls, I don't see any special cross-training shoes. I don't see any granola bar wrappers. I don't see any bottles of water. Just the geyser pony, the walking stick. So hardy souls. And I look at the women especially, kind of encumbered by all of those Victorian garments. There's some little top hat kind of looking things here that the men were wearing. So curious but hardy souls. Famous people came up to the geysers as well. This person right here, excuse me, I need to put this up. Here's one of the curious hardy souls. Sitting on the porch of the Geysers Hotel is my 14-year-old grandpa, Frank, and his John Muir. Jack London came up to the geysers, rode horseback from Glen Ellen, from his home in Glen Ellen. My grandfather had some wonderful stories about talking with Jack London. My family left the geysers in 1911 to start their own business bottling mineral water in the Bay Area. But by that time, sulfur and steam was coursing through my grandfather's veins, but he couldn't make it back to the geysers permanently until 1948. So, meanwhile, in the 1920s, John Grant from Healdsburg came up to the geysers, wasn't as interested in hospitality as he was in drilling for steam. So he drilled 8 steam wells. His dream was to provide electricity to Cloverdale and Healdsburg. His vision never materialized, but one of the wells, Whistling Annie, provided electricity to the resort for years to come. Luther Burbank was intrigued by his idea as well and invested in a company that John Grant put together for development of steam power. In 1938, that beautiful hotel burned to the ground. The cabins were spared. But ironically, it burned during a rainstorm. But a landslide kind of dislodged a gas pipe and an explosion ensued, and the rest is history. In the late 30s and early 40s, a couple of doctors had a vision of modeling the geysers resort after the Warm Springs, the therapeutic resort in Georgia that FDR had visited. After a few years, their vision didn't materialize either. So, my grandfather and his wife Hazel arrived at the geysers in 1948. My grandfather had 5 grown children. He was 56. And here my grandparents were taking on this big venture when most people were kind of considering, looking at retirement. But truly, it was kind of an idyllic time when the geysers was a family destination, a family resort. We had camping and hiking and swimming, the natural steam caves, the mineral baths. And we had a rod and gun club for sportsmen, entertainment. We had this beautiful structure that had been rebuilt after the old hotel burned down. A lovely Knotty Pine Lodge, Knotty Pine dining room, commercial kitchen with all built-in freezers, refrigeration, etc. Even a staff dining room, if you can believe that, in the back. Behind this structure was a swimming pool, lined on either side by dressing rooms, an outdoor dance pavilion, an ice house for supplying the housekeeping cabins who had ice boxes with ice, the geysers power plant, and a large garage. And this little building right here, which was the bar, kind of a family affair, 10 stools, called the Trails End. And there was like a swing set outside the front door, so mom and dad could sit there and have a beer, watch their kids play. Or they might have selected one of my grandfather's concoctions, a pink lady, which was made with sloe gin, which apparently was not slow. So the tourists would drive up, go into the lodge, buy a ticket, get a souvenir placemat. This is a laminated. They would start walking down this road to the bathhouse, about a quarter of a mile, cross the big Sulphur Creek on a wooden bridge to the steam caves, which were built into the side of the mountain, which was also the trailhead for this 1 mile loop around the Geysers Canyon. It was really gorgeous. I mean, I remember that when I was a kid. Outcroppings of minerals, sulfur, bubbling mud pots, natural springs, steamy pathways. People would bring jugs up and get water from the magnesium springs. They wouldn't collect water from the arsenic springs, nor the Devil's Ink well, but they enjoyed that and many people claimed it made them feel better. One of the things that kind of added to the atmosphere was the signage along this 1 mile hike. Each one of the features was labeled appropriately, and with language it was probably left over from the Victorian era, their penchant for that nice flowery language. So there was lots of signs that had Pluto this, or Devil's that, or the Witch's Cauldron, and so forth, the gates to Hades. So it all added to, the fun and flavor of the Geysers Resort. Many groups of people that were interesting came up to the geysers. There was a colony of White Russians in the Bay Area, and they loved coming to the geysers and taking the waters, was the expression. They also liked sitting in the steam caves and swatting themselves with freshly cut bunches of bay leaves, releasing the aromatic oils. Kind of a precursor to aromatherapy is what they call it now. Very expensive, very chic. They were just ahead of their time. So they came to the geysers year after year, and to tell you the truth, before products like Aleve and steroid shots in your knee and your back, and home jacuzzis, bathtub, hot tubs, backyard hot tubs, people really could relax in the waters up there, and some people really did get some relief from arthritis and the gout and rheumatism, as the literature explained. The entertainment at the resort was provided, and I'll put this postcard on the table here, by this couple, a 12-year-old strawberry blonde, the son of the cook, and the 4th grade vamp of the Geysers Canyon. We put on pantomime shows in the beautiful Knotty Pine dining room after the dinner service on Saturday evenings. We even took our show on the road to the big time, to the Cloverdale Citrus Fair. So, this particular picture was a popular piece, and with all the authority of a 12-year-old, we did a duet here, and Mark sang to me, "How could you believe me when I told you that I loved you, when you know I've been a liar all my life?" And I would retort, "Well, you promised me diamond rings and all those things," and et cetera, et cetera. So the guests got a kick out of it, and they would contribute costume jewelry and scarves. One lady even brought up kind of a moldy old fox stole. Remember those with that poor little fox face there? I thought I was living large. But it was a very, very fun time. And I'd like to acknowledge my family because, with all of the facilities up there was a lot to keep up. And they worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And how they ever got the energy on Saturday night after the dinner service to completely reconfigure the dining room, move all the furniture, make a little makeshift stage, and have the show go on. I truly am, in awe, and I thank them very much because up at the Big Geysers Resort, I had a very, rich childhood. Of course, if you asked me then, I would have said, all I want to do is live downtown like a regular kid, have a TV, and watch I Love Lucy. Now, what did I know? So, in 1957, the resort once again burned to the ground. The core buildings, right here, the cabins were spared. That DC, that direct current, overloaded the wires, an electrical fire, and that was it. It really was a devastating setback, but my grandparents rebuilt this kind of very large rectangular utilitarian building out of basalite brick, a prudent building material for fires, and they built a brand new, beautiful new pool. But in truth, the geysers never really had the charm that it did before the fire. In fact, the fire kind of was the beginning of the perfect storm, which signaled the demise of the geysers as a family vacation destination. There were some other elements. For instance, the 99-year lease to the Geysers Canyon that proprietors for several decades had enjoyed came to an end, so no more hiking on the Geysers Trail. It was the embryonic stage of the geothermal industry, so it kind of became a construction zone. Lots of challenges with noise abatement. You would walk outside and you couldn't hear yourself. You couldn't hear conversations. In fact, you had to wear earphones because to protect your hearing. So very off-putting for visitors and pretty hard for the people who lived up there as well. So, Mother Nature added the last note to the perfect storm when she blew out the side of the hill in a steam field. One morning we woke up and the entire geysers resort and canyon was covered with a layer of gray volcanic ash. Every building, every car, the picnic tables, the pool, every blade of grass, etc., was covered. A very eerie looking scene. And of course, when it rained, it was gray mud. So the Big Sulphur Creek became kind of a muddy morass. The fish didn't like it, and the fishermen didn't like it much either. The blowout was a topic of conversation for a couple of months up there. The drilling foreman came down the next couple of days after it blew out, and he asked my grandfather, I need every mattress in the place to stuff down that hole. My grandfather said no, but the cook, who had an old jalopy that she couldn't afford to repair, said, well, take that. So they towed it up the hill, slammed it down, the blowout, and what do you think happened? Nothing. Didn't even faze it. So, due to very, very smart, capable geothermal engineers and people on the hill, they did bring the blowout under control, and I believe it's contributing to the power grid in Northern California to this very moment in time. So, basically, the geysers as we knew it and loved it came to an end. So, one door closes in life, but another door opens. And my family was very fortunate because their new customers were the legions of people it took to develop that mighty geothermal mountain. The dreamers, the visionaries, the investors, the scientists, the engineers, the geologists, lots of geologists. They all rubbed elbows in the dining room and the bar of the Big Geysers Resort. Add to that, the drillers and all of the tradespeople it took to build that very complicated infrastructure of many power plants and the road systems to connect them all. So at any given time, the 20 cabins would be filled with maybe a couple of PG&E accountants, some roughnecks, some plumbers, carpenters, operating engineers. It was a very, very busy time, and my grandfather was in the middle of it all. He really loved that high energy time. Probably the most colorful group up there during that time were the drillers. They were called roughnecks, and they were oil drillers from Oklahoma. Oil drilling is a dangerous enough profession, but in those pioneer days, There were some unknowns in steam drilling, which increased the risk factor exponentially. For instance, at the top of the drilling derrick, they suspended a cable down to the nearest sturdy tree. They call that the Geronimo line. The thinking being that if the well blew and the drillers couldn't jump off the platform to safety, maybe they would have time to climb to the top and hop on that Geronimo line down to safety. So to my knowledge, fortunately, there were no such blowouts on that hill. A good thing. But these guys, they'd come down completely covered with the grime and the grit and the mud of drilling all day. Dead tired, they dragged themselves into the dining room of the bar. Pretty soon you'd hear, bam, the slam of those leather dice cups on the counter. And my grandfather would be telling jokes and telling stories, laughter would ensue, and the guys would be unwinding at the end of a very tough day. So, very dangerous work, very hard-working guys, and frankly, a very hard-living bunch of guys. And if you must know, my family gave me strict orders to stay away from them. People in the industry know what I mean. So, magma power, thermal power started it all. Dan McMillan, president of Thermal Power Company, played football in the 30s for Cal on the Wonder team. A lovely gentleman, crazy for my grandma's lemon meringue pie. B.C. McCabe, as a young man, drove a car up to the geysers in 1925, and it never left his imagination. And 30 years later, after a career as a stockbroker, he put together Magma Power Company, and the rest is history. You know, there's a black brass plaque up there on Magma Well number 1, indicating basically this was the beginning. So, the geysers was a fascinating place and a crossroads for all types of people. Characters, talented, smart people, a lot of hard-working people, different cultures. You know, they all crossed roads at the geysers. So for the next 2 decades, the resort just followed along with the development of geothermal power on the hill. PG&E scheduled lots of tour buses up there, educating the public about this marvelous new energy source. They always stopped off at the geysers for my grandma's homemade beef stew. But you know, the years were getting on, and soon my grandmother and my great aunt, who was 90, moved to Santa Rosa to live with my mother. She taught school in Santa Rosa for 30 years. So this kind of brings me to the end of my talk to you tonight, because it basically was sort of the end of the resort. Now, we all remember words like hippie and flower children and cults and counterculture. Well, a few representatives of those groups discovered the geysers in the mid-1970s and enjoyed it up there. The nature and the baths and whatnot. Personally, and this is an editorial statement, I believe what they really enjoyed was the geysers was way out in the boonies. There are just a few employees and an elderly gentleman, my grandfather, who ran the resort, and they pretty much could practice their counterculture ways with little restriction. So, Union Oil was on the hill at that time. Union Oil and the family very worried about fires. You know, these folks were all over in undesignated areas, like campfires, smoking things. Their behaviors were very distracting, so to speak, to the workers on the hill. So, when things would get over the top, my grandfather would call the Sonoma County Sheriff, very cooperative, very good to my grandfather, but Sonoma County is a vast domain. And by the time the deputy would get to the base of the Cloverdale or the Healdsburg Road, it was nearly another hour up to the resort, and by that time the miscreants had scattered into the mountains. So it became a game of cat and mouse. Basically, it was an untenable situation. My grandfather loved that place. He would not give up. And a few days before his 87th birthday, Frank Curry passed away in his sleep in the place that he loved so well, the Big Geysers Resort. So nowadays, when we go up and visit the property, we kind of drive up a road right here. There's not one vestige of what existed there over the last 160 years. But the Calpine guard kiosk, and of course Calpine is the very capable master of that mighty geothermal mountain today. And so when we go up there, I try to imagine the thousands of conversations that have filled that airspace over the last 160 years, a thread through parts of 3 centuries. Whether it be the hopes and dreams of the hosts who were so proud to show off the geysers and all its wonders, to the hopes and dreams of the visionaries and the developers and the geothermal industry, to just the regular conversations of our guests who loved coming up to the geysers for years and appreciated all of the resort amenities. Most of all, my grandparents would love you to remember all the laughter and the good times with good people at the Big Geysers Resort.
Well done, well done. We have in the audience 2 people as a special guest, Bruce and Carmen Selfridge. Bruce's great-grandfather owned the Geysers Resort from 1893 to 1919. Bruce, would you stand to be acknowledged? Bruce will be available at the reception. There's an exhibit partly on his family at the History Center. And I would like you to ask Bruce about the railroad that his great-great-grandfather was going to build. Joseph, you're up.
I'm going to be presenting a geological history of the geysers, followed by the development history of the geysers. And that's a lot to do in a short period of time, so it seems like I'm hurrying in places. It's because I probably am. First, though, can everybody hear me okay? Great, thanks. This is a view. Okay. This is a view looking north from the central part of the geysers. This is the Sonoma Power Plant and the Unit 17 Power Plant, the Unit 7 and 8 Power Plant. And this area, intervening area, is just about 20% of the geysers. Tossing out a few geysers facts here before we launch into the geologic history. The geysers shown, the geysers field is outlined there by the red line. And it covers a huge area for a geothermal field of 35 square miles. The 12 miles from end to end of the geysers field is 3 miles further than the distance from Geyserville to Cloverdale. The Geysers is the world's largest geothermal field in terms of actual generation. This is a ranking of the geothermal fields, the top 15 geothermal fields in the world by production. And the Geysers, as I say, is the largest and has been for quite a few years, but it certainly wasn't the first. That honor goes to Lardarello in Italy, which actually began generating geothermal power Zealand. And then 2 years later, in 1960, the geysers began producing or generating geothermal power with a whopping 11 megawatt unit number 1. And we'll talk about the growth of the field from there. But first, we need to talk about the geologic history of the geysers. The geologic history of the geysers really starts about 15 million years ago with when volcanic activity began in the hills south of San Jose. And over time, the volcanic activity migrated north through the Berkeley Hills up into the Napa Valley, and then at about 2.6 million years ago, Mount St. Helena was erupting. By 1.1 million years ago, volcanic activity was centered in the area around Cobb Mountain. And that is on the northeastern flank of the Geysers geothermal field. The Geysers geothermal field shown by the dashed line, and Clear Lake shown up here at the top of the map. Oh well, over time, the volcanic activity migrated from around Cobb Mountain up toward the east arm of Clear Lake, so that the youngest volcanics are around the east end of Clear Lake and are only about 10,000 years old. But getting back to the geysers area, while this volcanic activity was occurring at the surface 1.1 million years ago, something was going on beneath the surface, thousands of feet beneath the surface. There was a large magmatic intrusion forming in the subsurface, shown by this figure. And if you look at the outline of the geysers field, the dashed line, and look at where that large magmatic intrusion was taking place, you have to guess that those were somehow related, and they certainly were. If we look at a diagrammatic cross-section through the geysers field, we see this 1.1 million year old magma intruding. MA is a geological abbreviation for million years ago. And it was intruding at 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. This is pretty hot stuff. And it had a profound effect on the rocks overlying the magmatic intrusion. And what it did to them was it recrystallized them. It made them brittle and hard. And then finally, it thermally fractured them. So when this magmatic intrusion was done in placing, it left the overlying rocks hard, brittle, and broken, and hot. All of the ideal conditions for a geothermal reservoir. There's only one thing missing at that point, and that's fluids. We need some water in there for there to be something to produce. And nature came to the rescue. Cold groundwater began circulating deep into that fractured mass of rock. And as it circulated deep, it became heated. That's shown by these color changes here that I put in there. And as it became heated then, the water became more buoyant. It began to rise back up again above the crest of this magmatic intrusion. As it did so, it became mixed with magmatic gases that were just boiling off of that intrusion. Gases like hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen chloride, CO2, which when mixed with water formed acids like sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, and carbonic acid. These fluids then migrated up to the top of the fracture zone and reacted with the rocks in that area to form clay minerals and deposit silica. Now, these mineralogical changes serve the purpose of plugging up all the permeability and porosity in the rock and making a tight seal above the geothermal reservoir. And this is important because if you don't have a cap rock, an impermeable seal, then the energy just is lost to the surface as hot water migrates to the surface and dissipates the heat to the atmosphere. So between 0.6 and 0.3 million years ago, we have an ancestral geysers hot water reservoir at 600 degrees Fahrenheit that's heated by even younger magmatic intrusions into this older one that we talked about before. At 250,000 years ago, a very dramatic event took place in the geysers. I would love to have been able to watch it from a distance. The impermeable cap rock fractured, resulting in a phreatic or steam eruption. This would have had to have been just a huge catastrophic event. And as this steam vented to the surface, then the pressure began to drop within the 600-degree hot water reservoir, causing it to begin to boil down, and resulting in a boiling water table between hot water below and a steam cap above. And over time, that boiling water table then would boil all the way to the bottom of the reservoir, leaving us ultimately with a 465, with steam in the fractures at 465 degrees Fahrenheit and 500 pounds per square inch. Now, anybody who's familiar with how a pressure cooker works can look at this and instantly recognize an enormous natural pressure cooker created by nature. This is exactly how one works. This is just one on an extraordinary scale. Well, the most recent event to take place geologically in the formation of Geysers Reservoir was a very young intrusion in the northwestern part of the field, perhaps even as young as 10,000 years, which geologically is about that long ago. And in that part of the reservoir, we have the formation of what we call the high temperature zone, where temperatures up to 750 degrees have been measured. Just an aside, Calpine is currently developing this high temperature zone, and it's a real challenge because the steam is extremely corrosive. But they're working on it and figuring out how to deal with it. So this is the state of the reservoir then when exploration and development began. And as Karen eloquently described, that began in 1922 when John Grant, who was a gravel quarry operator in Healdsburg, began drilling wells along Geyser Canyon. He would ultimately drill 8 wells. This is well number 2, completed in 1923, over 300 feet deep, 307 degrees Fahrenheit, and 63 pounds per square inch of pressure. That 63 pounds per square inch is important. Most people recognize that as about twice the pressure that you run in a typical car tire. But if you're going to use steam to run a steam engine or to turn a turbine, you've got to have pressure. And this well was one of the weaker ones. Later he would drill a well that actually had 300 pounds per square inch of pressure and produced steam at a temperature of about 417 degrees Fahrenheit. The first 3 of his wells were drilled by a fellow named Glenn Truitt, who was 17 years old when Grant hired him. And he drilled his wells using a cable tool rig. A cable tool rig, some folks here might know what that is, but most people probably won't. It's a kind of a primitive way to drill a well. Basically, what you do is you put a chisel on the end of a heavy piece of pipe, like that one, and you repeatedly hoist it up high in a derrick and just drop it, and just hammer and chop a hole in the rock. It's slow and it's tedious, but it's effective, and eventually you'll get a well if you keep at it. And they got 3 wells this way. Last time I saw a cable tool rig was in a junkyard in Idaho in about 1970, but I'm told that they're still used in certain places. In 1923, after the first well was completed, John Grant found a steam engine at the Fabiano Winery in Healdsburg, which I believe is still where it was, which is today, I think, still located where it was then. And being a clever fellow, he talked them out of it and brought it up to the geysers and hooked up the steam engine to the first well that had been completed, and then used it to do the mechanical lifting to pull the cable tool up into the derrick and to drill well number 2. So already geothermal power was being used to achieve, to produce work in the geysers. Karen mentioned that Grant formed the Geysers Development Company, and he did that to raise money for his drilling activities, and sold stock. And Luther Burbank, shown here turning a valve, was one of the stockholders. This is a group of people celebrating the successful completion of well number 2. You see John Grant standing here second from the right. The well is discharging steam out into Geyser Canyon, which is obscured by all the steam blowing out there. you see the derrick for the drill rig standing back here, and this kind of a shed in front of it. The reason for the shed was that as this cable tool was dropped, it would occasionally hit pockets of pressurized steam that would then blow a bunch of rock up into the air. Some of the rocks would be the size of footballs, and obviously if one of those landed on your head, it would wreck your day. So the shed was to protect the driller from getting his skull crushed. The cable tool drilling gave way to rotary drilling in 1925 when wells 4 through 8 were drilled. And the Diamond Drilling Corporation of I believe located in Southern California was brought in, and they used the more modern rotary drilling technique to drill those wells. Rotary drilling was developing rapidly at that time because the oil and gas industry was just exploding in the middle 20s, and especially in California, in the southern San Joaquin Valley and in the Los Angeles Basin. This is the derrick to the rig that they used, and it's not quite, they're not quite finished erecting it, but in it you can see similarities to modern day rigs. But this rig was still made out of wood timbers. And there's a fumarole, a natural steam venting in the foreground here. Well, by 1925, Grant was starting to realize that his dream of selling power to Healdsburg was probably not going to materialize. I mean, that was his whole goal all along in drilling, was to do a Larderello type of a development. We think he probably knew about that development in Larderello 11 years earlier, although there's no documentation to prove that. But by 1925, it was becoming apparent that oil and gas was going to get cheaper and cheaper, and already most municipalities were building power plants to run off of oil fuel to run boilers to make steam to run their steam engines or turbines. So after 1925, there were no more wells drilled by Grant. He still hoped to bring his project to fruition, but he kind of knew that it probably wasn't going to happen. And in 1925, he sold his controlling interest in his Geysers Development Company to Robert Baring, who started Signal Oil and Gas Corporation, and to Frank Wood, who was one of the co-founders of the Harley-Davidson Motorcycle Company. There was, however, power developed in the geysers, and power generated in the geysers, as Karen mentioned. They hooked up the steam to a couple of wells, to a steam engine, and ran a small generator to provide power for the Geysers Resort. And they generated a whopping 35 kilowatts. Well, 35 kilowatts doesn't sound like much, but if you think about it, that's enough to run 350 100-watt bulbs. And in a remote location like the Geysers, that was just a tremendous luxury. This is the first location in which the power for the Geysers Resort was located. A few years later, 1930, it was moved down to the resort itself and placed in this garage that probably had two steam engines and generators in it. Steam was provided by Grant's well number 7, known as Whistling Annie. I believe that was his best well. This is a steam engine. This is either one of these steam engines that was there or one just like it. The steam moved a piston up and down in this location that turned this wheel that by belt drive then ran this generator, which was probably about the size of a floor fan. This is an 1892 map of Geyser Canyon with Grant's well locations annotated, and the Geysers Resort shown here. In this area, Big Sulphur Creek runs pretty much east-west, and Geyser Canyon runs due north from there. Some of the interesting names, the steam vents and hot springs were located all up and down the canyon, and some of the interesting names that Karen mentioned, the Witch's Cauldron and the Devil's Wash Tub and so forth. The Grant's 8 wells were drilled along a terrace on the east side of Geyser Canyon. The photo we're going to look at next was taken from about this point right here, looking south toward the Geysers Resort. So from here, looking south. And you can see the Geysers Resort down in the bottom of the valley. The Big Sulphur Creek runs across here like this. This is Geyser Canyon, and you can't see much of it because all of the natural steam vents are filling it with steam. These folks standing along this terrace are on the upper end of the terrace that Grant drilled his wells on that extended out that way. If we look at Geyser Canyon today, it's a whole different look. That photo was taken from about right here, and Grant's wells were drilled on this terrace, and the Geysers Resort was located right about here. Well, nothing much happened after Grant sold his interest to Baring. Really, nothing took place in the 30s and 40s as the world suffered through the double whammies of the Great Depression and World War II. But by the 50s, all kinds of entrepreneurial efforts were taking flight, and in 1953, B.C. McCabe, the great geothermal innovator and pioneer, bought 3,000 acres of leases from Robert Baring. And about the same time, Dan McMillan started Thermal Power Company and leased up another 3,000 acres in the neighborhood. And these two fellows were, I believe, were buddies anyway, and formed a joint venture, the Magma Thermal joint venture, and drilled a bunch of wells over the next few years. Karen also mentioned this Magma 1 well, but it is a historical monument, and there's the brass plaque that marks it. The well was drilled in 1954 by Magma Power Company. It was only 680 feet deep, but when it began production, it produced 118,000 pounds per hour of steam, which is, by today's standards, enough to generate more than 6 megawatts of electricity. And even today, it's generating it's producing significant amounts of steam. I would have to guess that this well has paid for itself and returned its cost to investors thousands of times. The Magma Thermal joint venture drilled a bunch of wells and tested them, and there were some really, really good wells. And so they went to PG&E. McCabe went to PG&E and said, look, you guys generate electricity using steam to roll your turbines. I've got a bunch of wells out in the geysers that produce huge amounts of steam. Why don't you come out and build power plants, and I'll sell you steam, and we'll all get rich and be happy. And PG&E was unimpressed. Now, this story was told to me by a Phillips Petroleum executive who knew B.C. McCabe personally. And this is the story that McCabe told him. He said PG&E was totally unimpressed. They told him that when you open up those wells and start flowing them, that steam reservoir is going to go flat like a big tire with a puncture in it. McCabe protested, no, it's not. We've tested them, and we have an essentially unlimited supply of steam in that reservoir. So PG&E said, okay, fine. You open up those wells and blow them to the sky for 6 months, and then shut them in. And if the pressure comes back, we'll talk a deal. So my understanding is that this photo was taken during that extended period during which all those wells were just venting to the sky. Now, this could never happen today. The air quality people would have an hemorrhage, you know. But photos don't lie. This was quite a flow test. And so, as a result of this test, then PG&E was convinced that yes, the reservoir did have an enormous supply of steam, and so they entered into a contract with Magma and Thermal in 1958, and in 1960, the first modern power plant went online at a whopping 11 megawatts. And it's a modern power plant, but kind of an early modern power plant. Notice it's only got 3 cooling tower cells, and 11 megawatts is a pretty tiny plant by today's standards. But nevertheless, it was a beginning. One thing to note is that the Magma 1 well and all of the Magma thermal wells were drilled in the same area, basically, that Grant had drilled his original 8 wells. The Magma 1 well, in fact, was drilled right between wells number 1 and 2 and 4. The Unit 1 power plant that PG&E built was located right here, followed a couple of years later by went online in 1960, followed a couple years later by Unit 2. Units 3 and 4 were built in this location a little later in the 60s. In 1971, Units 5 and 6, now named the McCabe power plants, went online and is still producing today. As you can see, it's in the photo, it's still there. It's been modernized several times. But basically, all of this early development took place in the very area that John Grant picked for his development, so he had it right. The Geysers Resort, as we noted, it was here, and Geyser Canyon, you see, has got lots of vegetation and even large trees growing in it. There is still a little bit of steam to be found in Geyser Canyon. In the winter, you can find a little steam seeping out along the edge of the road up in this area. Well, modern drill rigs have changed quite a lot. This rig has a working platform 30 feet off the ground, and the derrick stands 110 feet above that. Here you can see that they're running a liner, a hot liner they call it, and steam is blowing up through the derrick as they get ready to screw another joint of pipe and lower it into the ground. And wells have changed a lot. All of the Magma thermal wells were a couple thousand feet deep or less. Today, a typical well often goes to 8,000 feet, and the deepest wells are around 12,000 feet, with several strings of heavy wall steel casing cemented to the formation above that to protect the wellbore and keep it from sloughing in. Power plants have gotten a lot bigger and more impressive too. This is the Unit 20 power plant that was initially built as a 119 megawatt generator. Notice it's got 11 cooling tower cells compared to the 3 of that Unit 1 in 1960. And this one power plant was designed to produce roughly 10 times the power that Unit 1 was built to generate. The only way I could think of to show the crazy rate at which development took place in the geysers was to use a graph. So I'm sorry, but I lack imagination. Years shown along this scale, 1960 to 2010, and the red line shows installed generating capacity. Now that sounds complicated, but that's just how much electricity a power plant can put out if it's operating at design. And we see that in 1960, Unit 1 went online here, and over the rest of the 60s, Units 2, 3, and 4 went online. So that by 1970, there was a total of 84 megawatts of electricity being generated in the geysers. In the 1970s, a lot more power plants went online, and the power plants got bigger. So that by the end of the 70s, there was 700 megawatts of generation online. And in 1989, the Aidland power plant was the last power plant to go online, and the installed generating capacity hit just a little over 2,000 megawatts. Now the purple line is annual steam production. And you can see that annual steam production pretty much tracked along with installed generating capacity until 1987. And then something crazy happened. The peak production, or the production began to drop off. And what that indicated was that already this field was incapable of providing enough steam to the power plants that had been built. And what followed then was a catastrophic decline. This annual steam production fell away rapidly, and many of the plants had to be downsized and remodeled to generate at lower rates and use less steam. And at this point, it became clear to us that if we didn't, well, now at this point I need to talk about water injection. You'll notice that annual water injection increases along with annual steam production, but that the gap between those two lines gets bigger and bigger with time. The reason for this is that a modern power plant needs cold water to generate efficiently. And the only way to provide a large supply of cold water in the geysers was to take the steam condensate and run it through cooling towers to chill it. Well, when you do that, 3/4 of the steam condensate gets evaporated to the atmosphere and is lost. So the gap between steam produced and water injected back into the reservoir just kept getting bigger and bigger over time. Now the operators thought, or perhaps it was just wishful thinking, that natural recharge would provide water into the reservoir to make up the difference. And as it turned out, natural recharge was almost nil. So by this time we knew we had to have more water for the geysers. Well, wastewater injection came to the rescue. In 1997, we began injecting about 8 million gallons a day of Lake County's wastewater into the geysers. And in 2003, that trick was repeated with another 11 million gallons a day of Santa Rosa's wastewater. So that now you see the difference between annual injection and annual steam production. There's not much of a gap there now. And maybe nature can provide that much natural recharge. And you'll notice also that steam production is essentially flat over the last 10 years, as is generation. So the Geysers has a good-looking history now, and owes a lot of that to wastewater injection. This is my wrap-up slide. The outline of the Geysers field is shown here, and you see the yellow area here is the area that was developed prior to 1970. The orange area is the area that was developed by the end of the this is the area that was developed in the 60s. This is the area that was developed in the 70s. So by 1980, this was the extent of the developed field. In the 90s and on, well, of course, the rest of the field became developed. These kind of scratch mark looking things are individual wells, and I've plotted many of the 450 or so production wells that have been drilled in the geysers. Currently, Calpine is developing this area in the northern geysers where that high temperature reservoir is that I mentioned. And so you see there's only a few wells up here. And that is the end. Thank you.
Am I live?
John Avery.
Let's see if I can take this one. All right. Let's go. There we go. You want to put this on? There we go. I'm going to attempt to do this mobile. We'll see how that works. All right, so my name is John. I'm an engineer at the Geysers, and I want to say thanks for this opportunity from the Historical Society to talk about Calpine's operations at the Geysers. And so when let's see if I can actually do this. I might not be as mobile as I thought. I can be semi-mobile though, that's still okay. There. So when I accepted the invitation to talk, I was wondering, well, what can I really say about the Calpine's operations at the Geysers? And I thought if I could at least break it down to who, what, where, when, why, and how, I would at least touch the highlights. And so let's see how this goes. So actually, originally, Mr. Elliott had suggested that, John, why don't you just tell us what you do? And I thought, well, geez, I spend a lot of time in my office and I go to a lot of meetings. That might be really boring and quick presentations. So what I thought would be more interesting would be to tell you about the people that do the work that make the Geysers work. And so let's start off with operations. And this is a picture of our central control room. And so let's think about your car. In your car you have a temperature gauge and speedometer and a fuel gauge, and then check engine light. And so in our central control room, the operators are monitoring that, doing some controls, and then they can report problems to maintenance. So for example, if something like the check engine light comes on, you want to know, is it just a false light? Is it a real problem? And how big of a problem is it? And so they would report that problem to maintenance. And we've got roughly the equivalent of 17,000 of those check engine lights. By the way, is the sound quality okay? Is it okay? Okay. So let's move on to maintenance. And so the problem gets reported to maintenance, and maintenance department plans, schedules, and executes the work that needs to get done. And so here I've shown some mechanics that are working on a steam wellhead that may have some problems. We also have a civil crew. Here they're running some of their heavy equipment to fix up a pipeline right of way. And you can see some of the terrain that they have to work in. We also do a lot of electrical work, and here you see some preparation for electrical work. And also we have quote-unquote painters, officially insulation and coating specialists. So here the foreman's checking out the condition of one of the pump basin walls.
How many people work at the Geysers?
That's a great question. And so in conclusion about who we are at the Geysers, I'd like to mention also that every once in a while an engineer, that's me, does get out of their office and put their hands on the equipment. We have 300 people, and so that breaks down to about roughly 70 to 80 people in operations, about 110 people in maintenance, and then the balance of that 300 would be engineers, project managers, accountants, and of course we must mention geologists also. All right, so what is it all about? And what's involved with all this stuff that operations and maintenance and engineers and geologists are doing? Well, I mean, it's all about the end product is making electricity. And so how do we do that? There's really 6 key things. We need the heat, make steam, eventually it gets converted to electricity, and then we need some cooling to condense it and put it back in the ground. So that's kind of the basics here. And I know Joe is going to make a point that I better make here, that at the Geysers, instead of hot water coming to the surface, the Geysers is a little special. We do have superheated steam that comes up and feeds our power plants. And so let's go into a little more detail on the what here. So the power plants, this is actually, Joe had mentioned Unit 20, he took that picture was from the other angle. This is Unit 20 here with Unit 18 in the background. And so what you can see in this picture are the pipelines that transmit the steam from the wells to the power plant. You've got the power plant here, the turbine building, and I'm going to go into a little more detail about the conversion process there. And then you've got the cooling towers, which provide the required cooling for the condensation so that the steam can do its conversion to electricity. So let's look inside the turbine building. And this is a steam turbine. Now, obviously, this is a non-operating turbine at the time the picture was taken. That is during assembly of a turbine upgrade that I was the project manager for. So what you see here in this picture is the rotor. and the rotor is a shaft with blades on it. Here you have the casing with nozzles in it, and so the nozzles direct the steam at the blades so that they'll rotate. And so how that happens is that the steam comes in through the center, and this is called a two-flow rotor. Half the steam would go to the left, half the steam would go to the right, being directed by the nozzles. And so the amount of steam energy that can be converted to electricity is a function of the steam flow rate, and Joe showed you a graph how that has been dropping off. We also need high steam inlet pressure, and we want really low turbine exhaust pressure here at the back end. And you can see how as the pressure of the steam drops as it goes through the turbine, the size of the blades have to get bigger because the steam's getting less dense. It's hard to see in this picture, but what happens is the steam exits the end of the turbine and then exhausts downwards into the condenser where the condensation occurs. And then also not shown in this picture, you see the shaft there to the right is actually the generator. And so the turbine during operation is spinning at 3,600 RPM, also known as 60 hertz, our grid frequency. And so this turbine is coupled to the generator, and then the generator is making electricity. So kind of the end point of the conversion process is the generator needs to get its power out to the grid. So here, coming out of the turbine building, we've got the generator cables, which are tied into the transformer, taking it from 13,800 volts up to either 115,000 volts or 230,000 volts, the grid voltage of the PG&E system. And that ties into the PG&E system there. And so that segues to, okay, what it is, this goes to the where part of it, and where does our power tie in? And so you see Cloverdale here. And so the Geysers actually has a direct feed to Cloverdale, and if you've ever looked over to generally towards the east, you see the transmission line coming down over the hills. And so feeding the rest of the North Sonoma County here, a little circuitous route, and then another circuitous route through Fulton. Fulton substation is what you would see driving south on the 101 by the River Road offering. And then there's this map is specific to PG&E's 115,000 volt system. There's also a 230,000 volt system that runs in parallel and then feeds into the Lakeville substation in Petaluma. And so this is kind of a microcosm of Sonoma County, but really we're tied into the big state grid. And so this is kind of this where about the transmission line tells a story of how we feed our product into the market. So why do we even do this? Well, because thanks to the market and thanks to you, you need electricity. So whether you're at home or in your office, when you turn on the lights, using your computer, recharging your iPhone, turn on the microwave, maybe using some power tools on the weekends, you're buying our products, and we thank you for that. And so how does it get to you? The grid, transmission and distribution, and it's coming from us. Now this is a standard Calpine presentation slide here, and this is actually showing one of our gas-fired power plants, not a geothermal power plant. But conceptually, these three steps are the same. And also it kind of highlights the fact that Calpine does only one thing, which is produce electricity, wholesale power, and then provides it to utilities, including locally here PG&E, to go to your house. Another interesting thing is fuel supply and transportation. That at the Geysers, we do that all in-house, and that is the steam wells, the reservoir and the wells and the pipelines that I showed earlier. So the Geysers is kind of special being an integrated fuel source and generation facility, unlike other standard forms of power generation. Also thinking about why we do this, I mean, there's a pretty good opportunity. First of all, with total market demand. So Joe mentioned he had to have a graph, I have to have a graph too. And so let's start with the y-axis. Sorry, this is starting to sound like a little bit of a physics class here, but annual electricity demand. So that's in units of terawatt hours. So just to think about your electricity bill, you look at your electricity bill, it's in kilowatt hours, right? So let's look at 2010, roughly 270 terawatt hours. That's 270 billion kilowatt hours. So when you go home tonight, pull out your latest electricity bill and see how that compares to 270 billion kilowatt hours. course. Now, the market demand, I mean, if you're comparing electricity market demand compared to the latest hot, cool electronic product, iPhone 6 or something, it's not that exciting. That's actually 1.3% growth compounded is the forecast. That's not really exciting. But what is exciting for us at the Geysers is that the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is the state law that requires the utilities to purchase green power, which geothermal qualifies, and currently requires 20% of all power to be green. And that's going to go up to 33% by the year 2020. So a growing slice of a growing pie means that the demand for our products can go up by 8% between now and the year 2020. That doesn't mean we don't have any competition, but the general market is going up by 80%. At least that's the forecast. And so now that's the minimum compared against that forecast, the total market. But it's possible that there's even greater demand. And so you think about our neighbors down south in Marin, they're able to buy a product called Deep Green from Marin Clean Energy, where they're buying 100% green. So we consider this a minimum, and that could go up. So providing even greater demand for our power. And if you also not only want green but local, the Geysers are right here. So going on to wind, shameless plug alert for Calpine and Geysers coming up here, but this is this past Saturday's renewable resources supply. Now, you remember this last Saturday? It was pretty hot, right? You may have had your air conditioner on. Now, just another graph, graph number 2 here. The gray here is the geothermal power that's provided into the grid this past Saturday, starting from midnight to midnight on Saturday. The light blue is the wind that was feeding the grid. And then you've got orange and yellow, which are 2 different flavors of solar. So you can see at one point in the morning, there was no wind or solar feeding the grid, period. And then it spikes up to a spiky peak. It dies off. And then the other thing to point out is that the wind just kept blowing that night. And at midnight, I don't know about you, but I was asleep. I might have my nightlight on. So some of the points are that geothermal, it's 24/7 rock steady compared to some of the other renewable resources. And so if you want renewable power at night, or when it's rainy or cloudy or foggy, or when it's not windy, you want geothermal. And so another win is that in the future, we're really interested in possibly building another couple power plants at the Geysers. Joe had pointed out that area that we're looking at, the high temperature zone area, and that's the rough area about where we would build these new 2 power plants. So actually, relative to the other Geysers power plants, pretty close to Cloverdale. And so if we build these 2 plants, that would be up to 19 new full-time jobs that would be provided. And so maybe we'd have more Geysers folks living here in Cloverdale. And also, remember the $700 million number, that'll do a little math and come back to that later. So an exciting opportunity, and so the construction and construction financing are dependent on getting a power purchase agreement, which we are still trying to do. And I want to finish up with how, and I want to use the framework or the theme of sustainability, which means many things to many different people. So I think I'm going to touch on a few facets of sustainability. And number one, and Joe touched on this quite a bit, is the recycled water programs. So both from Lake County and the Santa Rosa system, treated wastewater, which Windsor is now tied into. And so, it's an environmental and economic win-win for us and Lake County and Sonoma County. Lake County doesn't have to discharge their wastewater into Clear Lake, and Santa Rosa is not discharging into the Russian River, and that water is coming up here, helping us recharge the geysers. And then another interesting thing, 12 million gallons a day, so once again, for scale, 12 million gallons a day, that's 8,000 gallons per minute. So next time you are using your garden hose outside, that's 5, maybe 10 at most gallons per minute. So just think about 8,000 gallons per minute coming up to the geysers. It's a lot of water. But even as Joe's slide noted it, it's still not as much steam as we're taking out of the ground based on pounds per hour. So pretty cool stuff with the clean energy from recycled water. Also low atmospheric emissions. And so if you compare geothermal to coal or even our own gas-fired power plants, we're quite a bit cleaner in three key metrics for atmospheric emissions. CO2, which is the chief greenhouse gas, and then SOx and NOx, which contribute to low atmospheric ozone, so serious health problem, particulate matter, and acid rain. So the geothermal is really a win-win. Now, admittedly not zero like solar and wind, but remember my previous comments about us versus solar and wind, and I think we still win out. Also, I want to mention along sustainability, our support of community and handling our employees. And so we think about event sponsorship, like Mr. Elliott here mentioned. The Calpine sponsored this event. Another example of that would be the ASTI Tour Divine that's coming up. Calpine will be the Jersey sponsor. My daughter goes to Geysers Inn Elementary School, and so through our employee volunteer matching program, and I do volunteer in class, I was able to secure quite a bit of money for their school garden program. And there's been other support for the athletic program. So that's pretty cool as an employee. Property tax, now I know property tax is not voluntary, but I think it is notable that we are the largest property taxpayer in both Sonoma and Lake County, and that sums up to about $15 million per year. And that's where I asked you, here's where I asked you to remember the $700 million, and if you looked at your property tax bill, it's roughly 1% of your home value, and so what's 1% of $700 million? It's another $7 million potential of additional property tax if we get those 2 new power plants built, feeding into Sonoma County's coffers. Royalties, also not voluntary, but we pay roughly $21 million a year in royalties. Some of that which funnels back into the counties, and the leaseholders up there are private, state, and federal. So various leaseholders are getting benefits of our royalties. And then lastly, employee support. This is just one example, but it was mentioned that I recently got my MBA, and thanks to Calpine, I was able to pay the tuition to go to that Sonoma State program. And finally, geothermal education. So if you're interested, if Karen and Joe's and my presentations have got you interested in the geysers, we welcome you to come up and visit. And so, first of all, we have a really cool visitor center up in Middletown, recently remodeled, thanks to Federal Department of Energy funding, with these exhibits. And of course, you can't see in the slide here very well, so come on up and check it out. Also, we do tours. And so this is just this last Saturday's tour right here. And now you can't just drive up and take a tour, so please go to geysers.com, check out the schedule, and there's a system there where you can sign up online. So it's pretty cool that you can come up and check out the stuff we've been talking about. And so finally, I hope that between Karen, Joe's, and my presentation, we've impressed upon you the valuable, rare, and inimitable qualities of the geysers. Thanks very much.
Joe, come up. Karen? Well, Mr. Elliott, this guy with the front leg, is there any questions for our speaker? There must be some out there.
I didn't catch who actually owns the property, who owns the mineral rights.
Okay, well that's a deep, yeah, who owns the property and owns mineral rights? It turns out those are actually 2 separate questions with 2 separate answers. There are landowners. The landowners sometimes but not always own the mineral rights. And so we pay lease fees to the landowners and then royalties to the mineral rights owners. So sometimes it's the same, one and the same, and sometimes those are different entities. And actually sometimes it's a mixture. You might have half and half ownership of mineral rights.
They're all private, not county.
Oh no, we have quite a bit of BLM, Bureau of Land Management, land and state land. There's state lands up there also.
Yeah, it's roughly even mix, I think, of federal, state, and private land.
Any other questions?
Is this a $700 million
sourcing power from suppliers. And we may be a sub-supplier to a supplier. That's all to be worked out, nothing's settled at this point.
So the county's kind of going into the power business itself, right?
They would be a community choice aggregator, which is slightly different than a municipality provider like Sacramento Municipal Utility District is a large local one.
Over here, please.
How do you get the wastewater from where it is up to you?
Giant pumps. There are 3 pump stations to get the water just from Alexander Valley up to the top of the mountain.
And what sort of energy or rather power requirement was pumped out? 8,000 gallons per minute?
I think our annual average is about 8 megawatts to feed Santa Rosa Systems booster pumps. So that's just the Santa Rosa side of things. But we do not supply the power to their Wano treatment station in Sebastopol. So they pump it up to the base of the mountain, and then we provide the power to their pump stations to pump it up to our tank. How about the back?
There's a concern about earthquakes with expanding of the Geysers steam fields as happened in Switzerland.
Yeah, you know, it is a fact that geothermal production and injection causes earthquakes. And there are thousands of them per year, and the vast majority of them are too small to feel. But a small percentage of them are felt. The largest events top out at about magnitude 4, and those average about 1 every couple of years. So there's no evidence to suggest that the earthquakes are at all dangerous, but they are annoying, and our neighbors let us know about it frequently. You know, I know this isn't fair to say this, but one thought I always have when the neighbors to the geysers complain about the seismicity is that, you know, at the time that the geysers was developed, there was practically no one living around the geysers. The town of Anderson Springs had about 5 year-round residents. Now it's got hundreds of year-round residents, and the simple fact is, we were there generating electricity before they came in and started living there. So since we were there first, it seems to me like, but the earthquakes are not dangerous, and most of them are too small to feel. And yes, some of them are annoying, and I know I spent the night in a motel up in the town of Cobb and been awakened at 3 a.m. with what felt like a truck running into the other end of the building, and you sit up all of a sudden, what the hell was that, you know? And you think, oh, yeah, just very quick, lay down in the back.
One more question, last question. Go ahead, sir.
On the 2 new power plants, how long is it going to take, and is it going to be on the Sonoma or Lake County side?
Yeah, that'd be Sonoma County.
And how long about will it take?
Well, construction is roughly 2 years, but we haven't broken ground yet, right? So 2 years from breaking ground roughly. And I don't 100% sure if permitting is 100% done yet either, although I think the majority of that has been cleared.
Well, that's it. Let's have Don't go away. We have a gift from the Historical Society for each of you. A little bit of Sonoma County grape juice. Calpine was good enough to donate some books on the history of the geysers and what Calpine is doing. This is the book that we have over at the History Center this evening. There's a limited supply. They're free, so if you want one, help yourself. And I guess that's about it for this evening, except to say the next program is on the Cloverdale Cemetery. And this one is a little different because the cemetery needs to raise some money. There's a restoration effort to build a retaining wall in cooperation with the city of Cloverdale, and it's going to run in the neighborhood of $10,000. So we have a goal of about $1,500 that we would like to collect on October the 8th. And I hope that doesn't shy you away from being here. It's going to be a fun and interesting program, and we're going to have a few surprises for you. So, at that, please go to the History Center for the reception and talk to these great speakers. Thank you for coming.